Tonight, why it pays to be popular with the party if you want a big job. What does the reshuffle tell us about the Prime Minister and his priorities? The figures of Gavin Williamson and Dominic Raab, Robert Jenrick and Buckland are demoted or sacked, while the Prime Minister managed to keep his friends and his enemies close. We get full reaction from those who've seen the heat of a reshuffle from the inside. Also tonight, inflation sees its biggest monthly jump since 1997. Is the world economy prepared for what comes next? Hello, good evening. What should the reshuffle tell us about the priorities of this government? There is perhaps a uniformity amongst those who face promotion today. Liz Truss, Nadine Dorries, Nadeem Zahawi, amongst the biggest winners, rewarded not just for their loyalty to the PM, but for their popularity within the party. On a day that saw Labour challenge the government over its £20 reduction of universal credit, the reshuffle may tell us something of what lies ahead. This will be an autumn dominated by difficult economic decisions. The Prime Minister may well need to depend on those who are well liked by grassroots Conservatives to get his policies through. The publicly unpopular figures like Gavin Williamson and Robert Jenrick are gone. The embattled ones like Dominic Raab are demoted. And housing, arguably the trickiest brief of all in the midst of the building safety scandal, will get a troubleshooter in the form of Michael Gove. Let's cross now to Downing Street and join Nick Watt. Nick?
Well, Boris Johnson doesn't like reshuffles. He deeply regrets the way that he, under the advice of his former advisor Dominic Cummings, forced out Sajid Javid as Chancellor at the last major reshuffle. And then today he had another awkward encounter. That was with Dominic Raab, who this morning woke up as Foreign Secretary and as First Secretary of State. Now, the plan was to move him to be Justice Secretary. Dominic Raab regarded that as a demotion, and so he managed to upgrade his title as First Secretary of State to that of additional Deputy Prime Minister, as well as being Justice Secretary. Now, should point out the last time that a Foreign Secretary was moved and got the consolation prize of Deputy Prime Minister, that was Geoffrey Howe, and that did not end well with Margaret Thatcher over 30 years ago. Now, I understand that Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab did have a difficult encounter. It was a difficult conversation. I understand that Dominic Raab said to the Prime Minister, look, I have been very, very loyal to you. Don't forget, this is the guy who did stand in when the Prime Minister was very ill with COVID in hospital. And essentially, Dominic Raab said to the Prime Minister, I've been loyal and it's not fair on me. And actually, it's not in your long-term interests if I'm demoted in this way, and also to be subject to this sort of hostile briefing that he believes he's been subject to for a few weeks. Now, this reshuffle isn't over. Tomorrow, it's the junior and it's the middle ranks. I'm told that we will see a number of very junior women ministers being given the really, really senior middle-ranking Minister of State. Those are the ones just outside the Cabinet. Interesting, today we saw that Amanda Milling, the chair of the Conservative Party, she was removed. She was on the list as sacked. Well, she's come bouncing back in the last few hours as a Foreign Office Minister.
Nick, we'll spend a lot of the programme looking at the reshuffle and what it means, but quite a dramatic intervention with the business of government this evening. Just talk us through what's happened in the last half hour.
Yes, so as you say, Emily, in the last half hour or so, Boris Johnson, Joe Biden and the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, a joint statement talking about a new UK, US and Australian trilateral defence partnership. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to help Australia build nuclear-powered submarines. That may not go down terribly well in France, because I think that they thought that they were doing that. Now, in all the documents I've seen, I have not seen any mention of China, but I think it's pretty clear, you look at the briefings coming out of Washington, that this is very much aimed at China, very much sending a very big message to China. Look at that part of the world, not a million miles for you, there are going to be nuclear-powered submarines. Now, those submarines are going to be built in Britain. The Prime Minister is talking about thousands of jobs in this country to continue a capacity that we've had in the last 60 years. But, Emily, I do have to say, today in this street, it's been dominated by a reshuffle. Here's my look at how the day panned out.
Westminster has been waiting, and waiting with growing impatience for a cabinet reshuffle. And today, finally action. A Prime Minister on the move, no doubt remembering Margaret Thatcher's dictum that Prime Ministers have to learn to carve the joint. Happy outcomes for some.
I hope you can move quick.
Not so happy for others. A downward move from the Foreign Office for Dominic Raab after a hesitant performance on Afghanistan. Over to justice with the consolation prize of Deputy Prime Minister extracted from Boris Johnson in awkward talks. He turned a demotion into a promotion, one friend said.
Ben Wallace.
A happier outcome for Ben Wallace, who remains as Defence Secretary after widespread praise for his handling of the Afghan evacuation.
Because obviously there were difficulties over the Afghan pullout. You're confirmed, Dominic Raab isn't.
I think our armed forces did an amazing job in getting out some very desperate people out of Afghanistan and helping leave Afghanistan in a way that upheld our obligations.
And a return to Cabinet for Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who lost her seat when the International Development Department was scrapped.
And what do you think of Dominic Raab leaving the Foreign Office, Deputy Prime Minister, but some people are saying it's a demotion?
So I think remaining the Prime Minister's right-hand man is a fantastic role. He does it incredibly well. He is a really steady and reliable force, and I look forward to working with him in whatever role I have going forward.
In and out they came. Reshuffle day, a moment that Boris Johnson dreads. He can't bear delivering bad news, and he thinks all this excitement is a distraction from the serious business of government. But in recent weeks, he's been persuaded that it's time to act and sharpen up his team.
And so 3 members of the Cabinet were given their cards. Amanda Milling was also sacked as party chair. Moving up, Liz Truss becomes the first woman to serve as a Conservative Foreign Secretary, and Nadhim Zahawi enters the Cabinet at Education. In arguably the most significant appointments, Michael Gove will take charge of the Levelling Up agenda, and Nadine Dorries is in pole position to challenge what Number 10 regards as a woke cultural establishment. And 2 of the Cabinet big beasts stayed in place.
The lights are still burning in Downing Street, where the reshuffle continues into the night and into tomorrow. This was no radical reshaping of the government, no night of the long knives here, but there is a belief in Cabinet that Boris Johnson took decisive steps in preparing for the next general election, with Michael Gove in charge of the Levelling Up agenda and the socially conservative Nadine Dorries in charge of relations between this government, ever alert to the culture war, and Britain's cultural establishment.
A familiar ritual in a familiar setting. Headlines galore are guaranteed, but success of the mission will depend on tangible results.
Well, Emily, you'll see there that I mentioned those appointments for Michael Gove and Nadine Dorries. And the reason why I did that, and I think that's significant, is it's very easy on a reshuffle day like this that you focus on the great offices of state. There's been a row over the change of Foreign Secretary. You can be distracted over there when actually something really significant is happening on the other side of the field over there. And there's a big hope amongst supporters of Michael Gove that what he will do in taking charge of the Levelling Up agenda, that is the idea of directing resources at areas that feel that they've been left behind, the so-called red wall seats. They were always safe Labour seats, and they changed Tory hands at the last election. The hope is that he will provide a better intellectual framework for that. He'll then sell it, and then, crucially, ahead of the next election, he will then deliver it. Now, Nadine Dorries, I do have to say, Emily, that I've had cabinet ministers, I've had backbenchers coming up to me since that appointment, major raised eyebrows for her to be Culture Secretary because, of course, Nadine Dorries is a social conservative. And the big question is this the government taking a step in the direction of the culture war? I have to say the view behind me there in number 10 is that is absolutely not what it is about. They think Nadine Dorries is a really good communicator. They think she's been a really good health minister. One person said to me it'd be great to have a Scouser in the cabinet. And also, in terms of culture, she has sold 2.5 million copies of her novels, which does mean that she's rather outsold the boss. Emily.
That could be dangerous. Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now in the studio is Peter Kyle, Labour's Shadow Schools Minister, Charles Walker, who was former leader of the 1922 committee, knows the parliamentary party well, and Anna Soubry, former cabinet minister, now outspoken critic of this PM. Welcome to you all. Peter, I guess you could say that's how you do a reshuffle. You don't need to take 36 hours and end up sort of promoting the person you tried to demote. It's all done and dusted in 4 hours.
Well, we haven't seen the rest of it yet because all the junior posts are tomorrow. But I think this was a reshuffle that was put together at the last minute because there was a big vote and a debate in the House of Commons today about the uplift and cancelling the uplift in universal credit, and this suddenly landed this day. So there was no theme to this reshuffle. There was no repurposing of government. There were some ministers that just had to be sacked through incompetence, like Gavin Williamson. There were other ministers that could be sacked because nobody noticed them, like Robert Buckland, and to make space for other people. And yet there was this weird sort of like shuffle where Dominic Raab was demoted and promoted at the same time. But nothing adds up to anything in particular. This doesn't indicate a new direction for the government. And well, for things like Gavin Williamson, for example, why sack him at the end of the pandemic? People like him should have been sacked at the beginning of the pandemic when it was obvious he couldn't perform. So we've had a wasted 2 academic years where Gavin Williamson has been underperforming, delivering a shambles throughout our academic system. Students having their futures really limited because they weren't able to perform in a system that wasn't working for them. And yet at the end of it, they get rid of him. It's 2 years too late. So, there's some real problems with what's been done.
Charles Walker, do you accept that this has all come too late in the day and that we've ended up now with very little diversity of opinion? Who tells Boris Johnson when he's actually getting things wrong?
Well, we've got a hugely diverse cabinet, haven't we? Rishi Sunak, Nadhim Zahawi, Alok Sharma, Kwasi Kwarteng, Sajid Javid, Priti Patel.
You're talking about race, presumably.
That really must have the Labour Party sucking on lemons. They talk a lot about diversity, but their party looks almost entirely the same. We've got Liz Truss as Foreign Secretary.
Charles, I just asked you something slightly different. I asked you something different, which is diversity of opinion. Now, when a Prime Minister has to take really important, really difficult decisions, isn't it important that there are people around him who will say, that's not such a great idea, or can we talk this through? There isn't anyone like that in that cabinet.
Well, I personally think there is. I think Oliver Dowden as party chairman, Oliver Dowden certainly wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth in any way, shape, size or form, and he'll be preparing the party for the general election. You'll see him appearing on the media. As I say, you can always pick a reshuffle to pieces, but it's pretty impressive. I think this chap from Eton that the Labour Party likes to deride so much, Boris Johnson, has done pretty well. And as I say, it sort of puts Labour to shame. We are the party. We have the cabinet that looks like modern Britain, and the Labour Party shadow cabinet looks rather stale, and clearly people are leaving it on their own volition before they're reshuffled.
Charles, we judge him on letting the thousands of bodies pile up by their thousands, not on actually his ability to sack some people.
OK, let me bring in Anna.
Peter, I can understand why you're disappointed, because you haven't got much of a narrative.
Can I bring in Anna Soubry?
But you're getting thumped out of the park, Peter.
Charles, can I bring in Anna Soubry? She hasn't spoken yet.
Let's try and root this in the real world, shall we? People don't particularly, at the moment, with this dual crisis and climate change. So we've got Brexit and COVID and the fallout from that, and then climate change to deal with. They don't care about the makeup of the cabinet. What they want is competence, and they want good government, and they want people who know what they're doing, and they want people with some big ideas to sort out the crisis that we're in. And when you look at this cabinet, I struggle to find anybody in it who can match up to what this country needs at the moment.
So Nadhim Zahawi just delivered the vaccine programme.
You've spoken an awful lot, Charles. Can I just say this?
That's
Nadhim
because I'm a
Zahawi
member of Parliament.
very, very... I know I'm not a member of Parliament. Frankly,
yeah,
I'm
but you're
rather
not
pleased
anymore.
given the state.
Anna has actually been she's been in cabinet, and she knows what it's like to go through.
She wasn't in cabinet.
OK, well, let her finish her sentence, please.
And what I was going to say was that Nadhim Zahawi is a very good appointment. Now, I know some would say that anybody but Gavin Williamson is a good appointment, but he genuinely is a good appointment. But the farce over Dominic Raab speaks volumes. You know, he wasn't good enough to be Foreign Secretary, but apparently he is good enough to be Deputy Prime Minister, and in the event of anything happening to Boris Johnson, to be Prime Minister.
Let me
the
ask...
appointment of Nadine Dorries actually says everything that's wrong and rotten about this Prime Minister's stewardship of this country, because it is an appalling appointment. She never made it even as a bag carrier in either David Cameron or Theresa May's cabinet, she was not in government at all, and for very good reason. And that is because she's not up to the job. She's somebody who cleared off to the jungle, who trashes anything and anybody that she doesn't agree with, and has... Well, I'm afraid that's the truth.
Okay, Charles Walker, come back on that.
That is what is being said by your colleagues, as well you know.
I mean, first of all, Anna says that reshuffles don't matter, but if they don't matter, why is it the lead story on Newsnight, and why are you appearing on Newsnight? But let's be perfectly clear, Nadine Dorries has been a health minister, Minister of State, at an incredibly difficult time in the Department of Health, has been an extremely good minister for mental health, and really to come on to this programme and just trash her like that, it's just not a very nice thing to do, to be perfectly honest. Nadine Dorries is an extremely capable communicator, an extremely warm person who is highly regarded by many people across all sides of the House of Commons. So by all means, dislike her because she's a Conservative, but to dislike her because she's a person, I'm afraid it's just not acceptable.
No, that's a very silly thing to say, Charles.
Okay, so let's get back to that question. Peter said, just a second, Anna.
In that department that has to be sorted out.
So
to say Nadine Dorries was a very good minister for mental health is a silly thing to say.
We can't hear you. Sorry, we just can't hear you at the moment. Charles, I'm going to ask you a question, which is whether the reward for those who are popular with the grassroots over the parliamentary party tells you how this government is working. Now, you know how unhappy many of your own MPs have been during the course of the pandemic. Do you feel that this is talking above their heads and straight to the grassroots party?
No, I mean, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. At the end of the day, there will be a general election in about 2 years' time, and ultimately the Conservative Party will either win that general election or lose that general election. So, yeah, we can talk about the personalities within the cabinet. I think it's a diverse cabinet. I think it's a pretty good set of picks, to be perfectly honest. And look, in 2 years' time, our record will be put to the people, and Peter can argue his point of view. Yeah. And and the Liberal Democrats can argue theirs, and we'll see what happens.
Peter, the problem is that Boris Johnson is currently getting stuff done. He's pushing through a painful national insurance tax. He's pushing through a social care plan, which nobody's done for 2-3 decades. He's removing those less able members of his cabinet. He doesn't look particularly scared of your party right now.
Well, the reshuffle today is a signal that actually he wanted to obliterate a debate that was in the House of Commons today. He wanted to put behind him a very poor week. It was mishandled, his landing of the social care. It was rushed. It was a botched landing, and actually he landed the tax rise but didn't land the plan to sort the actual problem out. And so let's just take education, for example. You know, most of the key indicators in education are spectacularly going in the wrong direction. Nadine Zahawi is clearly a more competent administrator than the predecessor, Gavin Williamson. But if you look at the gap in attainment between what is being achieved in the private school sector and the state school sector, it's got bigger, faster than any point.
Well, no,
but also between the rich students or wealthy students coming from and other students from disadvantaged background, the gap has got spectacularly wide in the last 3 to 4 years. But also, crucially, there is a 6% gap in the growth between those students from the northeast of England and students in London. So every single key indicator about getting the school system improving is going in the wrong direction. So we know that Nadine Zahawi is a better administrator than Gavin Williamson, but is he good enough to turn around this oil tanker which is charging in the wrong direction when it comes to running our school sector?
Anna Soubry, is there anyone that you think we are going to miss that's gone today? Do you think this is a fresh start for this government?
No, because there are actually very few fresh faces in the cabinet. I mean, as I say, it's good to see Nadine there, Zahawi, because he is very good, and I think he's got an awful lot to offer. And he's proved himself as the vaccines minister, but he served in education in any event. No, this in many ways it's just been a moving around of the deck chairs. I mean, why on earth Oliver Dowden was taken out of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, I just don't understand.
Okay. Let me
because the big job to be done there with this online harm He was well over that brief, and I think we will, or Boris Johnson will regret it. We as a country will regret it because it's such an important piece of legislation.
Charles, one thing we haven't spoken about is Preeti Patel. It is extraordinary that Preeti Patel was not moved in this. Now, that her relationship with the police and the people who keep us safe has broken down fundamentally, and she's still in the job.
OK, I want to ask one last question because we're running out of time. Michael Gove has been put into this arguably very tricky brief now, which is housing. Charles Walker, I don't know if that means that his brief for the union is now less important or considered less of a problem, but presumably Michael Gove has to sort out this extraordinary building crisis scandal that's coming down the tracks at him that's affecting a lot of people in this country now. Is that what Boris Johnson's priority is there?
Well, I think the Conservative Party at its best is building houses for people to live in, and we need to build more houses, and wherever Michael Gove goes, love him or loathe him, he gets things done. So let's get houses built. He'll have my support in doing that, and I hope the support of most of my colleagues.
Well, wherever Michael Gove goes, he does things. So it doesn't mean he gets things done. He does things that are incredibly disruptive. You know, I enjoyed watching Nick Watt a minute ago saying, describing how great his job was. I'm sure he'd been beaten down the phone by Michael Gove to say such things. But this is a demotion for him. He's been sent out into the wilderness. And actually, whether he has the power to level up, you know, for this government, levelling up is about bricks. We think it's about people when it comes to Labour.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for joining us this evening. We'll be returning to the reshuffle and the bigger picture of the where this takes the country, what it tells us about the leader at the centre of all this at the end of the programme. The UK inflation rate, according to official data released today, jumped between July and August by the largest amount since the Bank of England was made independent in 1997. Now stands at 3.2% and is likely to go even higher. So is this a temporary spike in prices due to the economic opening up? Should we be relaxed and focus on securing the recovery? Or might we have the start of a serious inflation problem on our hands, not just in Britain, but across Western economies? Ben Chu reports.
The Nobel laureate economist Friedrich von Hayek once referred to controlling inflation as like trying to catch a tiger by its tail. A dangerous business, perhaps even an impossible one. As we emerge from the global pandemic, are we in danger of losing control of prices? The Office for National Statistics reported today that between July and August, the annual rate of UK consumer price inflation jumped from 2% to 3.2%, the biggest recorded rise in that rate between 2 months on record. And it's not just the UK which is facing sharp price rises. Inflation in the US has breached 5%. In the Eurozone, it's at 3%, the highest in a decade. In Canada, it's at 3.6%. In the Western world, only in Japan are prices not rising rapidly. The view of independent central banks in all these countries, the institutions charged with controlling inflation, is that this spike in prices is transitory, a reflection of unusual price distortions related to the pandemic, like the UK's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and temporary supply chain bottlenecks in the post-lockdown opening up. But some economists worry that price rises could be more stubborn, that the public could start to expect higher prices, that workers could start to demand higher wages to compensate, and that governments could add to the problem with high spending, like Joe Biden's large stimulus bill this year. In other words, that inflation could get out of hand. So what would this mean for ordinary people?
A bit of inflation is a nice problem to have. The difficulty is that when inflation keeps rising and wages in particular don't keep pace with that. So people find that their pay packets don't go as far as they would otherwise have done when they try and spend money in the shops. Also, if inflation rises too far, then central banks are more likely to start controlling inflation by raising interest rates. So people who have large debts end up paying a lot more in interest, and that can be a problem for them as well.
At the extreme, some talk of a return to the economic dysfunction of high inflation and low growth of the 1970s. But how likely is this kind of monetary breakdown?
Our economy is fundamentally different than at that point in time. What we saw in the 1970s is what's referred to as a wage price spiral. And we have seen wages go up and we have seen prices go up. But unlike the past, US businesses have much less pricing power. Consumers for decades have gotten goods that were affordable. And frankly, in the durable goods space, for years, we've actually seen price declines.
It's easy to say that policymakers like those here at the Bank of England should simply withdraw monetary stimulus or even raise interest rates soon to head off the risk of inflation. Who would want to get their throat ripped out by a tiger? Surely better safe than sorry. Yet it's important to remember that these policymakers have to balance the risk of inflation against the risk of undermining the post-COVID recovery. That's why the question of whether these inflationary pressures are transitory or not is so important, not just here in Britain, but in the wider Western world.
The big problem is that a lot of these so-called temporary increases are proving to be both larger and longer lasting than anticipated. And there comes a point where you have to think there's something bigger happening here, which is essentially too much money chasing too few goods and services.
Oh, I'm team transitory all the way. And frankly, the consumer price index data that we got yesterday, inflation came down.
Ultimately, we'll simply have to wait to discover whether our grip on this dangerous beast is as firm as hoped.
Ben Chu with our report there, and joining us now is Larry Summers. He served in the Clinton and Obama administrations and was the chief economist at the World Bank. Professor Summers, you warned about US inflation. I guess you made a number of enemies by doing so. Are we now facing the same dangers here?
I'm less familiar with the British situation. In general, I think we're passing into a period where the greater risks are of economies overheating. We've got damage to the supply side coming from the legacy of COVID as businesses have closed, people have retired, and we've got a lot of pent-up demand from all the spending people couldn't engage in during the height of COVID, from the very substantial levels of fiscal policy we've seen, from the very loose monetary policies that we've seen, from the very high asset prices that we've seen. So my concern is we've set in place the tinder for real inflation risks. In my country, the United States, there are more vacancies than there have ever been in history. Workers are quitting at as high a rate as they ever have before. That suggests all kinds of wage pressure. Businesses are reporting more ability to pass on price increases. Businesses in general have more market power than they've had historically. So if you've got more market power, you've got more trade barriers, you've got higher shipping costs from abroad, you have an increased level of bottlenecks.
So can I just ask, if this is affecting many of the Western economies and it's coming straight after the global pandemic, doesn't that tell you that it is more likely to be transitory, that we will get through this?
I think the fact that it's a pervasive phenomenon, if anything, suggests that it has deeper structural roots and is more likely to be more permanent. I think it's frankly a known sequitur to suggest that because it's occurring in a variety of places, that somehow means it's more likely to be transitory.
I ask because Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell, former and current heads of the Fed, the central bank, they believe that it is temporary, that it's transitory. Why are they wrong?
I think they're optimistic. I think they're influenced by the mistakes that have been made for the last several decades, which were mistakes of being too alarmed about inflation and insufficiently alarmed about unemployment. But I think if you just look at the basic arithmetic of the rate at which spending demand is being increased, and then the rate at which the economy is producing, you see real imbalances developing. I think they are somewhat worse in the United States than they are in Europe, but we had figures just this week on inflation expectations that showed a clear break to the upside in the one-year numbers and a clear break to the upside in the three-year numbers. Look, every time there has been a breakout of inflation in the past, it has come as a surprise to central banks who were overly complacent. So the fact that central banks are complacent doesn't prove that they're wrong, but it certainly isn't a reason why everybody else should be highly optimistic about inflation. If anything, contrary.
And I wonder where this leaves the politics, because you've been quite critical of the Biden stimulus plan. Politically, those infrastructure projects, stimulus projects, are proving very popular. They're cutting through with Americans of all persuasions. And I wonder if you recognise that if he listens to you on the sort of fiscal side of things, he risks losing political capital at this moment.
Well, I'm not sure where you get your read of American politics. The read right now is that there's an enormous amount of controversy over the full extent of the spending that's proposed, and there's no bipartisan support for the vast majority of the spending. But that's not really the important point. I think the important point is that making fundamental investments is the right thing to do, but we need to pay for those fundamental investments. And if we do that, they will not be sources of inflationary pressure. But the key question is, are we willing to pay for those investments?
Larry Summers, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. So back to the reshuffle. When the dust settles, what difference will any of this make to the way we're governed or the policies we see? Does it tell us the Prime Minister is in bullish, brave mood, or that he needs reliable human shields to get him through a difficult winter? And does it matter there's so little diversity of opinion amongst the top cabinet team, if that is indeed true? Who can he rely on to tell him when he's got it wrong? Joining us now, Craig Oliver, David Cameron's former press secretary, who's been on the inside of a reshuffle or two. Salma Shah, former advisor to Sajid Javid throughout the May years, and Katie Balls, deputy political editor at The Spectator. Nice to have you all. I'm going to start with Craig just because he's here. What do you think this tells us about Prime Minister Johnson or Johnsonism?
Look, I think in number 10 tonight, they'll be pretty pleased with how this has gone. They'll think it's gone quickly and cleanly. They promoted some people that are popular in the cabinet. And as you've been saying tonight, that they're worried about things coming up and the backbench revolts, that kind of thing. They're worried about that. So having some popular people there. But I think most importantly, this shows a Prime Minister who's got an eye on the next election. He wants to make sure that he's shored things up in terms of competence. And the exposed flank of this government was, are you competent? I think they've spotted that. They've worried about that. The main briefing line from number 10 tonight is, look how clever these people are that we've brought in, and that you will have a competent, effective cabinet of doers.
Do you think it is competent, Salma? Do you look around now and think this is a cabinet that's going to move in a big, bold way?
I think certainly if you think about where he's chosen his big sort of moves and shifts away, so Gavin Williamson in education, Robert Jenrick out of housing, and Robert Buckland to an extent out of justice. They are three hugely problematic departments, both because they can offer, great uplift when it comes to the next general election, but also, the costs are spiralling out of control in a lot of these departments, particularly in justice. So he has put big hitters in each of these areas, with the exception of Nadhim Zahawi, who is new and needs to be tried and tested. But obviously has the confidence of the Prime Minister. But Michael Gove, I think, in housing is quite, I would say, an inspired choice.
Katie, where does this put Labour and Keir Starmer? Does he figure in all this at all? Because there was that sort of one outriding opinion poll which seemed to show the parties neck and neck. Did that spur any of this on, or do you think he's an irrelevance in terms of Boris Johnson's thinking now?
I think that if you think about the reshuffle, Boris Johnson was thinking about having a reshuffle ahead of the summer recess, but after both the Prime Minister and those close to him were put into self-isolation, any plans for that were derailed. So I think there's been something he's been thinking about for a long time, cautious about. I don't think that Keir Starmer is the first thing Boris wakes up in the morning. But I do think if you look at those social care policy, how it landed, the fact that there are polls suggesting that Labour are ahead for the first time in a long time, I do think there's a desire in number 10 to change the narrative, to reset, to say this government is refreshed, to go against the media narrative that Boris Johnson is to a degree at sea when it comes to his policy agenda. And I think this is geared at showing that things are moving.
Craig, you will know better than most that sometimes reshuffles land like budgets. We don't know quite what we're looking at until 24 hours later, and then you suddenly realise who you've got on the outside that can be quite dangerous to you. Do you think there are any nerves here? I mean, I'm thinking of Gavin Williamson in particular, because he seems to be, if you like, the most sacked tonight.
No, I think what it's shown is quite how confident Boris Johnson is in his power. The reality is most people thought, well, he'll have to move Gavin Williamson to something because, you know, he knows where the bodies are buried and he's going to start briefing against him if he's on the back benches and getting rebellions up and running. I think Boris Johnson actually felt quite confident in saying, look, actually, I'm going to put you on the back benches and do your worst because I feel quite strongly that actually you haven't done a good job as Education Secretary. The situation with Marcus Rashford last week was like the nail in the coffin of him, and I think that that probably made him feel much more confident about just shoving him onto the backbenches and say, well, if you think you can do well against me, then...
I guess the question is it his choice? Is it what he believes? Or has he just followed this Conservative Home poll, which is very closely aligned to the movement? I'm just going to ask Salma this, but you'll know the graph I'm thinking of, Salma, which shows that the people that the grassroots really like have all got the top jobs tonight, or at least have got promotions, and the people that the grassroots really hate are all out or demoted. Now, I don't know if that's a sign of confidence or if he is speaking to his grassroots party or if he's following popularity of somebody else. How do you read it?
He obviously is going to have to pay some attention to what the grassroots think, not least because these are the people who are going to go out on the streets and knock on doors for him when it comes to elections. So he does have to pay, some mind to that. I don't think this can be totally driven by, Conservative Home poll or any of the graphs that they produce. I think it does have to. I think there are lots of elements to this. Liz Truss is popular on Con Home. She's also a woman who's gone into a great office of state. That's something that they really needed to do. And I think they feel that with Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Nadine Dorries and Liz Truss, they're sort of ticking that box and getting more women into the top jobs.
Yeah.
So there's more of those considerations, I think.
Katie, Liz Truss is at the vanguard of global Britain now. She's talked very highly about her own trade deals. Other people have said on closer inspection they don't really hold up to much. Is that what we're going to be selling now to the rest of the world at a pretty critical time?
Well, there's a new international trade secretary, so I think there'll be a shift. But I think we can see from Liz Truss's time in that role what she's going to bring to the Foreign Office. And I think that it's been defined by how she is very keen to talk up Britain. And also, I think, there'll also be a shift from Dominic Raab in the sense that Liz Truss is more hawkish on China. I think you can see in the trade deals how she is tilting towards Trans-Pacific as an area of focus. And I imagine that will start to be reflected in the foreign policy.
Craig, where do you think the priorities now lie? I mean, if you look at this lineup, we tend to think of Michael Gove as the big hitter, although, the point Anna Subu was making is he manages to fall out with quite a lot of people along the way. Is the union less of a focus now than it was, holding it together? Is housing right up there now, or is he just trying to find a sort of a problem that needs solving?
I think he feels that Boris Johnson feels he's got to get runs on the board. He's got to demonstrate by the next election that the great promise of levelling up has been delivered on in some way, shape or form. So housing is clearly a very important part of that. Actually, education is a very important issue at an election time. School gate issues can be hugely important. So getting somebody who could be competent in there is profoundly important. So I do think it's a very political budget from that point of view, of looking towards the next election and saying, can we actually get some runs on the board and deliver with some people who are doers.
Yeah, and Salma, we were hearing from Nick. He talked to one person who said, the Scouser in the cabinet. Actually, I think there's 3 Liverpudlians now, and we've got a newly promoted secretary from Middlesbrough. Is this all about not just sort of levelling up in geographical terms, but it's about shifting the class sort of look of things?
I think quite often in reshuffles, we can all start reading too much into those people that are there. And I think what we have seen here is that the Prime Minister's really doubled down on the loyalty factor. Now, whether it's just sort of lots of working class people who tend to like Boris Johnson in cabinet, I don't know if that's true or not. But I think sometimes we can read too much into these characteristics. I think loyalty really is the big issue here.
Although people that were very loyal to him are now out. I mean, when you think of the people that ran his election campaign, Gavin Williamson and Dominic Raab, who stood in for him when he was seriously ill in hospital. So maybe loyalty doesn't get you all the way.
Well, Dominic Raab still managed to get Deputy Prime Minister as a title, so I think there's still some warmth between them there. But I do take your point on Gavin Williamson, although, like you said right in the beginning, I think it's very difficult to write him off.
Katie, do you see this as the first step in a sort of decade of a Johnson premiership, and would you be able to look at what Johnsonism might mean?
I think the hope is this reshuffle will go some way to meaning we can answer that question in a year or so's time. I think that it is a reform reshuffle. Boris Johnson is trying to put reformers in the departments where he needs to drive change. I think he accepts that at the moment it's really hard to define what a lot of these phrases, including levelling up, actually mean in practice. And that's why people like Michael Gove, Liz Truss, Nadine Sahori, they all fit into that. But going back to Craig's point, I think this is ultimately Boris Johnson showing that he's not particularly worried about having enemies on the backbenches, old-time supporters, people who could cause him trouble, loyalists that are all been sacked in various ways today. And I think it's him saying, well, that is not something that's going to stop me from going ahead with my agenda.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for joining us. Just before we go, we'll whiz you through the papers. You won't believe what's on the front pages. A bit of reshuffle. Johnson wields the axe in Cabinet. Liz Truss leaving Number 10. Yesterday appointed Foreign Secretary is the picture that a few of them have got. The Daily Mail says at last Boris wields the axe. PM's culling of falling ministers as new party boss says prepare for election. Very much what you've been hearing from our contributors tonight. Financial Times has Johnson sweets out his Cabinet to revive faith in the reform agenda. Long-standing allies sacked, focus on levelling up. MPs welcome sensible choices. And that surge in inflation to a 9-year high dents trust in the Bank of England's competence on price rises. That is all from us for tonight. Emma is with you tomorrow. Hope you'll join her then. Till then, bye-bye.